Good afternoon. Welcome to day 5 of Truth and Reconciliation Week. I am Stephanie Scott, the Executive Director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. We are absolutely thrilled and honored to be joined by the Honourable Murray Sinclair. Today, we want to say welcome to you.
Bonjour. Thank you very much for having me.
Your Honor, we wanted to hear from you today about what is the most important thing for the youth of the country to know about residential schools.
Okay. All right. I'll be glad to share that with you. First of all, welcome everybody, and thank you for having me as part of the day. Just wanted to also acknowledge the events that all occurred yesterday. As you can see, I'm still wearing my orange shirt. I feel like I haven't gone to sleep yet because I was up late last night and then got up early this morning in order to keep participating with some of the survivors that I received lots of calls from survivors yesterday and today. So that activity was a very important day, and I hope that those of you from across Canada who have been observing events this week will have had a chance to participate in what went on yesterday. I also want to acknowledge all of the survivors and the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, the survivors of residential schools, because this is an important time for us to be talking with each other and talking about the experiences that our ancestors who went to residential schools had. And I think that for those of you who don't know what that experience was like, I'm going to share a few words with you to tell you a little bit about what we learned. I was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There were two other commissioners, Commissioner Marie Wilson and Commissioner Chief Wilton Littlechild. We traveled across the country listening to survivors and also listening to people who had worked in the schools to get an idea about what they observed and what they knew had happened in the schools with regard to the children who were sent there. Residential schools were a policy of the Canadian government, beginning with Confederation, where they decided to take children away from their parents, supposedly to educate them, but really the purpose of the schools was not to educate so much as it was about indoctrinating them into a different belief system than what they had grown up to believe, or their parents had and intended for them to know, or what their people knew, or what their people would have been able to tell them. So the intent was to take these children away from their parents and place them into these schools in order to train them to do menial labor. So the education component was a very small part of what the schools were about. But the primary purpose of the schools was to indoctrinate the children into believing that they were inferior people, that they came from inferior stock, that they didn't have people who had a civilization, they didn't have a valid history, they didn't have any rights, they didn't have a proper religious system, they didn't have a proper relationship with God, the Creator, that they were uncivilized, that they were savages, they were heathens, they were pagans. The approach that residential schools took was to indoctrinate the children into believing that, and then to give to them or force upon them a belief system that was based upon white Anglo-Saxon or French religious teachings. And so the intent was to teach them how to be like the little white children who were being taught in their families and in their communities as well. And to separate them from their families, separate the Indigenous children from their families while they were doing this. The purpose of doing so was because the government of Canada wanted to be able to take their lands more easily. At the time of Confederation in 1867 in Canada, most of the people in Western Canada, the vast majority, well over 70%, close to 80% likely, of the people in Western Canada were Indigenous people. So this was a population of people that dominated Western Canada. And after Confederation, the government persuaded their leaders to sign treaties surrendering the land to the government, or to the crown. And then they inserted in the treaties certain clauses which required the Indigenous people to obey the laws of Canada, to comply with existing rules that the government wanted to impose upon them, to not interfere with settlement, and to allow white settlers to go wherever it was that their traditional territories used to be. And that was because the government needed to be able to take the lands away from the Indigenous people and expand into the West. Western Canada was not part of the original nation of Canada. And Sir John A. Macdonald, who was the Prime Minister at the time, he wanted to expand all the way to the West Coast, to the Pacific Ocean. And in order to do that, he conspired with corporations such as CP Rail in order to run rail lines across traditional territory. And in many cases, of course, he convinced Indigenous leaders to sign these treaties, promising them certain things in the treaties. One of the things that he promised to the leaders was that the government of Canada would build schools on each of the reserves of the people so that they wouldn't have to move to send their children away, but that their children could go to school in their communities, and the government would pay for the teachers and would pay for the education of those children in those schools. That was in each of the treaties of Western Canada, but the government didn't follow that promise. The government broke that promise right from the beginning by establishing these, what they initially called industrial schools. Now, the purpose of the industrial school and the basis of the industrial school model came from a study that had been done in 1858 by a man named Egerton Ryerson, who had been asked to look at what kind of public school system should we have for our children. And he proposed a public school system that was very much based upon the English educational system going on in England at the time, because that's where he came from, and that's where many European people in Eastern Canada had come from as well. So he used the English educational system. But one of the components of the English system was that education was reserved for the upper classes, and the common people didn't get the same kind of public schooling that the upper classes got. They got a different kind of schooling. He proposed that the best model for Indigenous people was an industrial school model based upon the reform school system that was in place in England. And the reason he said that is because Indigenous people are mentally inferior to non-Indigenous people. And therefore, they would not be able to understand and cope with an educational system that would produce lawyers and doctors and career professionals. He was a very racist guy in his thinking. And so he proposed an education system for Indigenous kids based upon these industrial school ideas. And so the industrial school model became the residential school model that we saw being developed by Canada. After the residential schools were created, the first ones were called industrial schools, but after they were created, the government realized that they needed to enact laws in order to ensure that the indigenous people complied with the government's wish that all the children go there. So they passed a law in the 1880s which said that every Indian child, under the Indian Act, they created this law. Every Indian child had to go to one of these schools as directed by the Minister of Indian Affairs. And if they didn't do that, then their parents would be sent to jail. And often, based upon the records that we were able to see and the history of policing in the West, as we've been able to read it, the people who were arrested were often the mothers, because they knew that the fathers could not take care of the children. And so any of the children that were still remaining at home. So the father would often agree to send his children to the residential school in return for his wife being released from custody or not being prosecuted or not being sent to jail. So we saw that on more than one occasion. Children were therefore forcibly removed from their parents. We heard about lots of incidents of children being scooped up from the communities. Agents would come in from the government and just collect all these children together and put them on trains or put them in cars, put them on boats, later on put them in airplanes and fly them off to residential schools. And the parents wouldn't see them, sometimes for years at a time, but certainly for the remainder of that year, there was no allowance for the children to come back home to see them. And the parents themselves were not allowed to go and visit the children in the schools. They created what was called the Indian Pass system, so that indigenous people leaving their reserves to go somewhere had to get a pass, a written pass from the Indian agent first. And if you didn't have an Indian pass, then you could be arrested and detained, and they would often hold you in custody for a long time and then send you back to your community. It was not a law, so to speak, so they couldn't prosecute you, but they would lock you up and detain you. And then the parents couldn't see their children unless they got a pass from the agent. And sometimes the agent would let them go and do that, but they had to promise not to try to take the children out of the school in order to get that pass. We heard many stories, and in fact, my own grandmother often talked about the fact that her mother would come and camp outside the school in a place where she could be seen by my grandmother, so that she would be able to see her daughter in the school. And that's how difficult it became for them to be there. My grandmother, as a residential school survivor, was never allowed out of the school to go back home to her family. And in fact, when her mother died because of a health outbreak, she was not allowed to leave the school in order to go to her mother's funeral. And that created all sorts of resentment and anger on her part. She originally wanted to be a nun, but she gave up on that as soon as this was something that they had done to her. Lots of other children in the schools were subject to very harsh discipline if they continued to speak their language, or if they continued to practice their culture, or if they wanted to go back home or tried to run away. If they misbehaved in any way, they could be locked up in little rooms in the school, or they could be disciplined with the use of a rod or a stick, or they would have their food withheld from them for a time. If they didn't like what they were eating, and if it caused them to become ill, they were forced to eat what they were given, or sometimes we were told that they were forced to eat their own vomit if they threw up. And so the children themselves were being treated quite harshly in the schools. We know from the study of residential schools, as well as from a study of other public institutions where children were being incarcerated in the 19th century and early 20th century, there was a tendency for institutions like that to attract pedophiles, children abusers. And pedophiles would go and work in these institutions. And while there, they would sexually abuse the children. And so there was a lot of sexual abuse that occurred in those schools where both boys and girls would be sexually abused while in those schools. And of course, the physical abuse that took place, the harsh discipline often resulted in injuries. And so being a student in those schools was not a very good experience. And we know that there were several instances of children who ran away and tried to go home. And some of them made it, but many of them died while running away because they had to go long distances. And they were leaving and running away in harsh weather conditions in the wintertime. There are stories of children who ran away from school in groups of 3 or 4, and their bodies would be found frozen on a lake somewhere. A story of Charlie Wenjack, which is now part of a very famous story that was publicized by Gord Downey, and Charlie Wenjack, the Jenny Wenjack story, is just an example of the kind of thing that we had heard about while and what was going on in the schools. And even those who worked in the schools who were kind people often got caught up in this. They didn't have the ability to resist the supervisors who were making them do these things. And so we heard from some people who worked in the schools who said that they knew what was going on and they tried to do what they could to prevent it, but it was too difficult. And many of them left the schools as soon as they could and stopped working there. We heard from teachers who said they would not list on their resumes the fact that they used to work in a residential school because it embarrassed them to be connected to that kind of an institution. But we did hear about some of the good things that people tried. We heard about a principal up in Norway House, for example, who was given a very small budget to feed the children. So what he did was he pretended that there were more people working in the school, and he added those fake names to the list of employees. And so he would get funded for those fake employees and then use that money to feed the children. And that, of course, probably constituted fraud, but at the same time, that was his way of trying to do as much as he could for those children who were under his care. We heard from teachers who would take, when they would go home for the weekend to their places, they would take some of the girls with them in order to protect them from abuse in the dormitories on the weekend, because the girls couldn't go home and they couldn't escape the abuse of people who worked in the schools, the men who worked in the schools. So that was an example of what it was like. And then we heard stories, of course, of children who died in the schools. We heard some horrific stories of children who died from abuse, who died from the physical beatings that they sustained. We were told stories of children who were deliberately murdered in the schools. But we didn't have much in the way of any sustaining evidence to be able to corroborate any of that. But we are satisfied that children died in the schools in large numbers. There was a study that was done in 1907 by a fellow named Dr. Bryce, who studied residential schools in Saskatchewan, and he concluded that anywhere, depending on the school that he studied, anywhere from 25 to 49% of the children in those schools died either at the school or immediately after leaving the school. And what he said was the government is coming very close to committing manslaughter by the way they treat these children in residential schools. And he warned the government that they needed to change the way they treated the children. And that report was given to the government. And as a result of that report and his refusal to withdraw it, Bryce was fired from his job. He tried to get it back, but he was always refused. And he wrote a book called The National Crime. And in that book. It was well publicized. But the reality is that very few people ever took his report seriously, even though it would have been in today's world, it would have been a huge issue. It would have been a huge matter for government to have to respond to. None of the media people picked that up as an issue about which they were concerned. It was not raised in Parliament as an issue that needed to be brought to the government's attention or brought to the public's attention. And it was because most people in Canadian society just didn't believe that this was the kind of thing that was happening. And if they were told about it, they chose to think that maybe it really wasn't true. Because the government was leading them to believe that what they were doing for these children, to these children, was in their best interest, that they were saving them, in fact. Because that was part of the message that Canadian society was being told through the school systems. And that is that, that Indian people were about to go extinct, and it was the government who saved them from extinction. So therefore, the Indian people should be happy that they were saved from extinction, that the government saved them from this life of misery. And so Canadian society, they drank from that Kool-Aid. And it was a message that was taught in the public schools of this country for a long time. It was certainly taught to the children in residential schools. But children who didn't go to residential schools, and about 60% of the children on reserves didn't go to a residential school, they went to a public school. The Indigenous children who went to public schools were also taught the same thing. And that message was that they were inferior, that they had no rights, that their people were irrelevant, that they were heathen savages, that they were people who needed to learn how to behave, learn how to participate in Canadian society, to stop trying to be different, and to kind of toe the line and become good Canadian citizens. And if they didn't, then they deserved what they got. And that message was also being taught at the same time to the non-Indigenous students who were there too. And so our public school system was essentially a school system based upon principles of white supremacy, based upon the idea that colonialism was a good thing. And therefore, anybody who didn't believe that colonial Canada was a perfect example of what a nation should be like. If they didn't believe that, then they were almost looked upon as treasonous, or people who didn't deserve to belong here. And keep in mind, incidentally, another fact that most people are not aware of, and that is that Sir John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, he believed that the only people who should be coming to Canada, who should be allowed to come to Canada, were white European people. He would not allow immigration from Asia. He would not allow immigration from South Asia. He would not allow immigration from Africa. He would not allow immigration from any country that had people of a different color, a different belief system, and a different language other than French or English into Canada. And the reality then is that for the longest time, Canada was only populated by white people from Europe and from European nations. And when you look at the settlement of Western Canada, you can see that. And therefore, Canada for the longest time was a domain of white European settlers. That changed shortly after the Second World War, but by then, of course, the process had already been established. And most of those people, of course, they had no idea of what they were walking into, so to speak. But they did receive the benefit of all of that treatment that Sir John A. Macdonald and his governments had imposed upon Indigenous people. And that is, the government took their lands, and then the government would give it to these settlers free of charge. every person who agreed to settle in Western Canada would receive a free grant of land from the government of Canada under the Dominion Lands Act. And if they farmed the land for a period of time, they didn't have to pay for it. I often hear people tell me that my grandfather lifted himself up by his bootstraps and he didn't need any government assistance. And I always remind them, said the settlers who came here received free land. And that land was obtained from the indigenous people at no benefit to them. So they were not paid for that land. That land was taken from them by the government, sometimes through treaty, but often not through treaty. So we see in British Columbia, for example, there is no treaty in British Columbia, and yet the government occupies all of that territory in British Columbia and claims to be the owner of that title without regard to the indigenous title, legal title that was in place at that time. And so this principle of indigenous sovereignty or Indian sovereignty, whatever one wants to call it, was reinforced by a crown law, by a law in England and inherited by Canadian law called the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was issued after the French and English War in the 1750s, in which France and England were fighting a world war all around the world, but in North America, over who would claim the territory, who could claim the territory in North America. England eventually won that war, and they got the French to sign a treaty and to leave. And those French settlers who were still here were allowed to remain, of course. But the crown was that by then, the English crown by then was pretty decimated after that war. They were in a state where they could no longer continue to wage war. And they were very concerned about the large number of indigenous tribes who could, if they took up resistance to them, could battle back. In fact, you may hear about something called Pontiac's Rebellion, where he started to fight back against white settlement into Indian territory. And he was successful in burning down posts and kicking people out of Indian territory. So the government was very concerned about that. And so they issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, putting limitations upon white settlers moving into Indian territory. And then they promised in the Royal Proclamation that Indian people living in their own territories at that time would be entitled to their own lands until they agreed to surrender those lands to the Crown. So the British Crown said, we recognize your right to your land. And yet Sir John A. Macdonald refused to do that. And the government of Canada has refused to do that since. And it is still an ongoing issue, not only in British Columbia, but in other parts of the country as well, where there are no treaties that cover the territories. So that's important to keep in mind, because until that issue is resolved, there's going to be difficult negotiations, difficult discussions between the government and Indigenous leaders. But all of that is background to the residential school examination that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did. We wrote a very long report, well over 6,000 pages. So there's a summary of it that's about 400 pages long. And I encourage those of you that have an interest in this topic and want to pursue it further, that you should take a look at that summary. It has some interesting pictures in it. And I think it's a good read. It's a good read for teachers. It's a good read for students as well, and students who are working on papers. The full report is available online and through the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. So don't be afraid to look at Volume 1 and Volume 2, which talks about this entire history. We talk about the Métis people, and we talk about what happened to them during the residential school era. Many Métis people were placed in residential schools as well, and they were subjected to the same abuse. The Inuit people from Northern Canada were placed in residential schools and were subjected to the same experiences as well. So I commend that to your reading. I think you'll find that it's something that you would benefit from knowing in greater detail through those reports. There's also a summary of the summary, which is available, I think, through the National Center. I commend that to you. If you can't read a 400-page report, you don't want to read the 6,000-page report, and you can't read the 400-page report, then read the summary of the summary, because I think it's about a 100-page report, 100-page summary of the 400-page summary. And it will give you many of the basic facts of all of this as well. So this is part of what it is that I think that you as students should be thinking about.
Yeah, Your Honor, pardon me, Your Honor, we're approaching the end of our time, but I wanted to see if we might ask you to think about and speak to, the youth across the country from grade 5 to grade 12. And by the way, we have some teachers and students listening in from Brazil as well. So we do have an international audience. Now, what should the young people of the country, do now or do in the future, to improve us, put us on the path of reconciliation in a good way?
One of the things that's very important in my view is that Indigenous youth should make an effort to learn about their own histories, their own connection to the past. One of the most important questions that we all have is to know where we came from. We did not come from white European settlers that came here. And we came from Indigenous people who have been here for thousands of years. So we need to inform ourselves about our own history. And so I suggest that the first thing you do is inform yourself about that. And then in terms of what it is that you can do, you should ensure that those who do not know that history understand that there is another story. There is another side to the history of this country and the country that you live in, that they should know, that they need to know in order to be able to get along with the people who are there. They cannot claim that you did not exist before they arrived. You had nothing to claim before they arrived. You need to challenge that. And so remember that. Education is very important here, and learning about it is very important as well. Denny?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor, and we'll turn it over to Stephanie for the closing.
Honourable Sinclair, I really want to say thank you and miigwech so much for taking the time to spend with us today. I know that you have a lot going on, but I am always honored by your words and continue to learn from you every day that I see you in the public. So miigwech.
Miigwech. Thank you. And thank you, everybody. Everybody have a good day and enjoy your dialogue and your discussions later. Miigwech, everyone. Yeah.
Bonjour, good afternoon. I would like to acknowledge that since I am in Winnipeg today, I am Treaty 1 territory on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Ojibwe peoples. I recognize we all work in different places and we live and gather and organize on various traditional territories. As this is the first Truth and Reconciliation Week, and it comes to an end, there are a few people that we'd like to give our sincerest gratitude for and their involvement in ensuring this week was supported and funded. Truth and Reconciliation Week is a national initiative made possible with support of staff at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the NCTR Governing Circle, the NCTR Survivors Circle, NCTR Steering Committee, and all staff have been integral to building this week. Thank you to our friends at AMP for their producing talents and media styles for communication support. Truth and Reconciliation Week was made possible with the generous support of funders, sponsors, and partners from across the country. We give a big thank you to the Government of Canada for their support and thank our presenting sponsor, RBC. This program became a reality with their contributions and those made by the NIB Trust Fund, Honourable, the Winnipeg Foundation, Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and to the provinces and territories that contributed in a meaningful way, and particularly to the many provincial ministries of education and organizations for their collaboration, understanding, and support. Thank you to our media supporters from APTN, CBC, Facebook, NFB, CBC Manitoba, Tele-Quebec en Place, Wapakoni, No Indigenous History, CBC Kids News. Thank you to our elders, knowledge keepers, speakers, and the survivors who participated in this week's program, as well as the Assembly of First Nations. I give special thank you to Elder Bone and to our drummer, Ray Stevenson, for the opening us in a good way, the Sacred Fire Keepers, and to the Honourable Murray Sinclair, thank you for your presentation as a knowledge keeper and for always sharing your wisdom with us. Lastly, I want to thank Honourable, the platform on which we were able to share this wonderful week of sessions. Truth and Reconciliation Week content will be available on the Honourable platform for weeks to come. And we encourage teachers to log in to access content and educational materials as the conversations in your classrooms continue. With this, we come to an end of Truth and Reconciliation Week. Thank you for all being present this week and for joining us as such an attentive audience. To the teachers, students, those committed to lifelong learning, and everyone who participated in this week, miigwech for your commitment and learning and growing as part of your journey of reconciliation. I hope you have all had a great day and will continue to do so the rest of the week. Thank you. Miigwech.